Welcome to this car seat. Today we are talking to Dr. Jeremy Bryce, LSE Fellow in the Sociology Department, who for the past 2 years has worked at the Center for Analysis of Risk and Regulation together with the Food Standards Agency on a series of research projects which were also to facilitate knowledge exchange and impact. One of the projects focused in particular on a very contemporary issue, namely the platform economy and how this affects food businesses and food regulation. So Jeremy, tell us a bit about the research.
Well, essentially this project came about because the shape and the structure of food shopping is changing, as I think anybody who's seen the myriad kind of Deliveroo riders zipping around London will know. There's a new group of outlets for food in town which are not traditional food wholesalers or retailers, but they're outfits like Just Eat, like Deliveroo and like Amazon Fresh. And these are marketplaces in which a variety of different vendors can sell food products directly to consumers. And they're a little bit different from for instance, supermarkets like Tesco, in that Just Eat or Amazon aren't selecting a fixed range of products which they then put on the shelves. Instead, any qualifying food seller can set up an account. They can set their own range of products. They can set the prices of the products. They can decide what information to provide to the consumer. So the way that outfits like Deliveroo and Just Eat describe themselves is that they say they're not a retailer, they're a platform, they're a neutral infrastructure which connects sellers of food with consumers looking to buy food products. And I guess this kind of new commercial role raises a whole load of questions. Who gets to sell food via these platforms? What measures are in place to make sure that the food being sold is safe and what it says it is? Actually, how are these platforms going about checking whether their vendors meet their standards? Who's responsible for doing that? So those were the kind of core questions which I wanted to investigate in this project.
And what did you find in your searches?
I guess the first and in some ways the most surprising finding was the sheer diversity of the digital marketplace sector, actually, even within the food domain. So when people think of marketplace platforms for food, they probably think of online takeaway order aggregators like Just Eat, like Deliveroo. They're very kind of visible. They're now taking about half of the takeaway orders placed in the UK, and they were certainly present and they were the biggest single group of platforms in my study. But there are also marketplaces for pre-packaged food products like Amazon, potentially like eBay, as well as more specialised marketplaces for groceries, essentially. There were surplus food platforms which specialised in selling food which was approaching its expiry date but still fit for human consumption at reduced prices because it might otherwise not find a buyer. There were actually the most surprising category was what I've taken to calling home cooking platforms, actually, which are focused at and targeted at private individuals who want to cook food in their home and then sell it either as a kind of ticket to a meal at a supper club at their house, or potentially even as takeaway food to the consumer in their home. And there were also platforms for catering services which allowed street food vendors and event caterers to take bookings online. And the vendors selling via these platforms were as varied as the business models of the platforms. So you had traditional food businesses which have a presence on a high street. The most obvious group there is takeaway restaurants and indeed sit-down restaurants, but there were also small food retailers looking for a wider audience of customers. but you also had food manufacturers and producers who might be selling their wares exclusively online or might be selling to retailers, but also selling direct to consumers over the internet. You had individuals selling food that they were cooking from home as well. So there was a real mix of different kinds of vendors, some of whom actually might not see themselves as being primarily food businesses, and some of whom might not necessarily qualify as food businesses at all under current regulatory definitions.
So I suppose your findings, let's focus on the FSA first in this. What is the challenge for the FSA for finding this kind of diversity of providers? Some of them inside the law, some are doing this stuff but they're outside the law. So how can the FSA position itself vis-a-vis such kind of varied economy?
I think that the first regulatory challenge actually is that some of these businesses are very difficult for state food regulators to spot. They don't have a shop which is on the high street somewhere, so when they start trading, it's not as if a sign goes up outside a building which announces that there's a food business here, come and inspect me. And actually, they may not decide to proactively register themselves because perhaps they don't see themselves as a food business. Perhaps food isn't their main commercial activity. So actually, the firms which operate these marketplace platforms, which are sort of their gatekeepers to the marketplace, may be better placed to spot these new businesses, to check whether they are actually registering and seeking out food regulators, and second, whether they're actually compliant with food law, and then to deny access to the market to any businesses which are selling unsafe food or are otherwise non-compliant. So there is a challenge of how do we reach these businesses, and also how do state regulators communicate with platform operators in a way which lets them sort of make use of their capacity to govern their vendor population, if you like. The second challenge is sort of if there are these new categories of food businesses which are sitting slightly outside of traditional regulatory tools, how do you develop modes of regulation which are adapted to those? So, for instance, the FSA faces an interesting challenge currently in that it's trying to extend the food hygiene rating system, which gives businesses a score out of 5 depending on how good their food safety procedures are, essentially, so that businesses have to display their food hygiene rating at the point of sale. And if you extend that to food sold online, then you have to display it on your website. There's a challenge in that currently the food hygiene rating system only covers food retailers and also food service businesses like restaurants and cafes, which hand over food directly to a consumer. So if you're a marketplace for groceries which has food producers and food manufacturers who don't have their own shops, they may not have a food hygiene rating to display. So there are questions about does the regulatory net need to be expanded in some areas to catch types of operators who might not previously have been subject to it. Also, potentially, if you've got people who are in professional chef services, so they go to somebody else's house and they cook a meal for them, or they're home chefs who run a supper club which may rotate around a variety of rented spaces. Current forms of regulatory delivery and inspection are focused on inspecting registered food business establishments. They inspect a building where a food business is assumed to be based. Now, if the business is a person who moves around a lot, then potentially if you're inspecting a particular building, the method you've chosen as a regulator may be slightly off target. So there are questions about how do we develop methods of checking compliance which are adapted to these new kinds of food businesses.
And for the world of research, what can we take from this, from these findings?
I think that the important takeaway for the academic world, no pun intended, is that actually many of the things which the firms which operate these marketplaces do are, in their own way, regulatory. So they some of them set their own food safety standards for their vendors. A few of them even conduct their own food safety inspections at businesses which want to trade via their platform. They're, in some cases, monitoring consumer reviews or changes in food hygiene ratings to check that their vendors are still compliant with food law. So you've got standard setting, you've got information gathering, you've got behaviour modification. These are kind of the core components of regulation. So platforms almost seem to be emerging as a new class of non-state regulatory actors, although some of them would probably resist that categorization quite forcefully, actually. So there's a contribution here to ideas about regulation beyond the state, but I guess getting a bit more specific, different platforms often had very different ways of exercising these regulatory responsibilities, which were very much tied up with their own commercial positioning as a business and the promises which they were making to their customers. So there was one group of platforms which was very adamant that they weren't going to set their own food safety standards in excess of the legal minimum. They didn't see that as their business. They felt that their core offer to consumers was that they would be open to anyone who wanted to sell food, and they would have the widest selection of products and of vendors out there. So as far as they were concerned, their responsibility was to step back from that process of standard setting, let state regulators do that for them, and to make sure they were open to all comers. There was a second, quite distinct group of platforms who felt that their core offer to consumers was that they were what they called curated marketplaces. So they were very choosy about which vendors and which products they allowed onto their platform. They had their own standards for food safety and food quality, which were more stringent than the legal minimum. And their pitch, if you like, was that actually everything that was sold in their marketplace was not only safe, but was really, really good and had been subject to these much more kind of stringent and interventionist processes of vetting. And so you had these very different ideas about the role and the responsibilities of the platform operator, which were backed up with concrete food safety measures in many cases, but which weren't driven by a legal or a kind of governance rationale, but were actually outgrowths of different commercial strategies. So I think there's a lesson for particularly the world of regulation scholarship in this, in that in understanding the roles and the attitudes of these non-state regulatory actors, it will actually be really useful to maintain a dialogue with disciplines like economic sociology and even with some of the work that's been done within the sociology of markets specifically, which have a close attention to the specificity of markets as institutions with their own rationalities and their own drivers.
And finally, if you could tell the FSA what to do next, what would be your sort of top 3 recommendations from your research?
I think the kind of initial and most urgent recommendations are actually to do with communication. The digital marketplace sector is very new, it's very rapidly evolving, and there's still a certain amount of uncertainty and ambiguity and confusion out there, even among marketplace operators themselves, about the status and the responsibilities of the firms which operate digital marketplace platforms. So are they food businesses? Are they subject to food regulation themselves? And if they are, what is it that they need to do in concrete terms to comply with food law? So actually one of the easiest ways to remove some of the current variation in practice around food safety within this sector would be to issue official guidance outlining whether marketplace platform operators are actually classed as food businesses. And second, if so, what are the things they need to do in order to fulfill their responsibilities under food regulation? And actually, there's a second point which relates to that, which is that often when enforcement action is taken against a business which is trading via one of these online platforms, if, for instance, an environmental health officer issues a hygiene prohibition notice which closes a takeaway down, the digital marketplaces which they're using to sell food online won't necessarily know this, so it's actually very difficult for them to identify non-compliant businesses in a timely manner and to take them out of the marketplace to ensure that they aren't selling unsafe food to people. So actually improving communication from regulators to platform operators so that they know when enforcement action has been taken would actually enable much greater control to be exerted over the selling of food online. And I guess looking further into the future as new kinds of food businesses start to emerge, it would be really good to see the FSA exploring new modes of regulatory delivery, which, for instance, might not be so dependent on inspecting registered food business establishments, inspecting buildings again, if you like. So, for instance, for types of vendors like people who are providing private chef services or people who are running supper clubs, it would be interesting to look at whether it would be possible to have a certification process for individuals which says this person is safe to sell food, rather than food prepared in this building is safe, which might perhaps exist sort of in parallel to existing premises-based inspection approaches.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin.